Caroline, I wanted to get your reflections on what you saw today in the Capitol Rotunda with John Lewis's body being brought there to Lyon State after basically touring Washington, D.C. past landmarks in his own history, in his own life, on the way to the Capitol.
It's hard to describe without losing composure how moving it was to watch what happened today on the Capitol, watching his casket being drawn across the bridge that he cemented on the right side of history yesterday. There is a part of me that feels such profound relief and gratitude knowing that his body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, and that was a right and historic dignity that was bestowed upon John Lewis. But I think that we're only beginning to understand the grief that we're feeling, I'm sure I don't only speak for myself when I say that we're just beginning to process the grief that we're feeling at losing Congress's conscience. And even, trying to put him to rest, he's left to give his own words at his memorial because he did it better than anyone. And I think we're going to be working to deserve him for a really long time, Lawrence. That's how I feel right now.
Well, we are out of wake, Caroline, so composure isn't all that important. I was really struck that Nancy Pelosi had the wisdom at the Rotunda to simply call on John Lewis to speak for himself, because yes, there were some comments made by Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and others, but there was nothing like hearing John Lewis's own voice with his own sentiments.
There's nothing like it. And I think part of that is to do with how sure he was of his calling, the work that he had to do. If everyone should take a moment and watch Good Trouble, you need to watch the documentary, watch this American hero, and understand the intention with which he crafted his art of saving this country in the ways that he understood. You think about how he preached to anyone who would listen as a boy. And the work that he did figuring out how to communicate the truth and build bridges and do that work in Washington, D.C. during some of the hardest chapters of this country's history is just extraordinary. And I think that his gift for rhetoric is one of my favorite parts of thinking about his legacy, because I think about the power of words and not violence that he left behind, and what an important precedent that is going to be for us as we move forward and try to live in his light and try to do right by the work that he put in place that we need to continue to manifest moving forward.
I think there's a lot of people watching today who might think that John Lewis was always a giant figure in Washington. He wasn't. He started in the House a couple of years, 2 years before I started working in the Senate. And I'm telling you, in those early years in the 1990s when he was there, people didn't know who he was. A lot of the younger people had no idea who he was. And I will never forget the day I got a call from him directly. He needed some help on a federal building in Atlanta. And I went to work for him instantly. He instantly had a Senate ally because I knew my senator would jump in immediately because we knew who John Lewis was. But he had to build his position in that House of Representatives, just like everything else he had to build in his life.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that he knew his worth. He knew how much the work mattered. And he had a fortitude that came from that kind of certainty, that kind of will to get in good trouble, because he knew that he had to get in the way. He knew he had to be that speed bump that slowed and blind ambition down in the name of human decency. And it made him unafraid to put his body on the line, to figure out how to use his words to make trouble. It was amazing. I'm so grateful to get to be a part of the work to carry on his legacy just by having these conversations.